One of the city's most prominent museums has totally rethought everything. Everything about its collection of bodies and body parts. The Mütter Museum gives us a sometimes graphic window into medical mysteries through its displays of human specimens. And now it has completed what it calls a postmortem project to come up with new and more ethical approaches to its displays of the deceased. On today's episode, we visit the Mütter Museum's beautiful building in Center City and find out how it's modernizing and how it educates us about the body. It's Monday, September 15th. I'm Trenae Nuri. Let's visit the Mütter Museum. So I took a tour of the museum the night of the Postmortem Project presentation, which laid out the 2-year process that you all went through and how you came to these new policies of displaying human remains and the use of images and videos. It was my first time because I will admit to you, I was squeamish about coming here and about what I would see. But I went to the lower floor, and behind one of the glass cases, it was the eyes. And specifically I3B, the chalazion.
Okay.
Because for those who don't know, it is like this lump that forms around your eyelid because of like a blocked oil gland. And I get them. And I have one, even though there's makeup on my eye. Yeah. And so I was curious, it was cool to see myself in some way here because my doctor does. We don't know why we get them. But do people who visit experience what I did?
Oh, yeah.
Do they come to get a better understanding of something that they experience in their lives?
Yeah, I think yes, even if they don't know that that's something that they are going to receive. And I'm Sara Ray. I'm the Senior Director of Interpretation and Engagement at the Mütter Museum and Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. And so just to give listeners a little more context on the eyes that you're talking about are not biological specimens. Those are like a series of wax models from, I guess, like kind of early 19th century, mid-19th century France that depict a variety of sort of injuries and diseases of the eye. And I always kind of joke that of all of the things in the museum, that's actually one of the items that makes me the most squeamish. And we actually find that a lot of guests respond very viscerally to those because they're really, really lifelike. They're very colorful. The eye is just something that I think people have a hard time seeing in a state of disease or injury. So they're very beautifully crafted, but also intense and evocative specimens. But, to your point about, do people see themselves have this moment of self-recognition in the museum? Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why, people feel so passionately about this museum. People with a variety of disabilities will often come in through the museum or chronic illness and see something like, severe scoliosis or spina bifida that they're like, oh, that's me, or, that's somebody that I know. The only thing that all people have in common is the fact that we have to navigate life in a body. And so those are moments of connection that we really want to foster with this new approach. One of the terms that Erin and I use a lot in sort of outlining what our approach to this work is to use this collection as a space to foster historical empathy.
There are replicas of human remains, and then there are real human remains displayed here. Can you give me a scope of how massive the collection is? How large is the entire collection of the human remains?
I'm Erin McLeary. I'm the Senior Director of Collections and Research of the Mütter Museum and Historical Medical Library of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. So we hold about 6,500 human remains. Most of those are partial remains, an organ, surgical material, a fracture. These were collected by physicians as teaching materials, right? So we're thinking the biological collection really stems from the 1860s to about the 1940s. So pre-photography, pre-color photography. Color printing is expensive during this era. So the collection of a specimen as a teaching object is what these physicians had available to them. And then they organized them into museums. And you should really think of a museum in this period as a three-dimensional classification system, like more like a library than, an art museum today. And they assembled these teaching collections, both for the benefit of medical students, but also for the benefit of the profession. And in this period, especially in the 19th century, physicians are really trying to work out what is the relationship between symptoms that you can observe during life and what's going on inside the body, which typically you can only observe after death in this period. So in addition to the 6,500 biological specimens, human remains that we hold, we also hold a large collection of wax teaching models, of plaster teaching models, paper mache teaching models, all of these three-dimensional objects that physicians were creating or collecting or purchasing or trading in order to convey ideas about what's happening on the interior of the body at a time in which, there was no imaging technology to allow you to do that during life.
Some of the questions that people have posed is the people that these remains came from and their consent.
Yeah, so that's a great and weighty question. And there's a couple components to kind of think through here. So collections like the Mütters were once very widely found in basically every medical school in North America and many large hospitals, as well as private collections that physicians might assemble, again, usually as part of their teaching career. When they assembled these collections, they saw themselves as the donor. So the language they're using around donation is the inverse of how we might think of it now. So the physician would be the donor, and they were donating to the Mütter or the Penn Pathology Museum or, name a medical school. It was going to have a museum. Material that largely was collected at surgery and autopsy for pathology collections. We do not know what conversations were being had in these clinical moments. But we do know that the concept that we now call consent is one that is post-1970. And they would not have used that language of informed consent. It was just a concept that wasn't available to them yet. But we do know that there were many concepts being used in the 19th century over the agency over your body, over your autonomy and agency over your medical care, and around permission for autopsy. We do not know what those conversations looked like because those were not being documented. But what was being documented and what we thought that we could find in the historical record is how people were thinking about these concepts of agency, of autonomy, and sort of permission in these historical periods. Philadelphia's public hospital, Philadelphia General Hospital, which closed in 1976, did have a requirement that if you received your care there and you passed away there, that you essentially agreed to be autopsied. I have not yet been able to find what that piece of paper looked like, but it is mentioned enough in historical sources that I'm on the hunt for that piece of paper, and I think it's out there. So we know that these discussions were happening. We don't know what the words being used necessarily were, but we can start to sort of extrapolate from what we know about 19th century, early 20th century Philadelphia, the types of medical institutions that were in the city and the types of practitioners who were donating to these collections, and kind of work our way to a framework of understanding what a particular person might have expected.
Can you just kind of simply explain what the Postmortem Project is?
No, it's not a simple project.
Okay.
Yes, I can do it. So through the generosity of the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the museum received a grant in 2023 to really dig into these weighty questions around consent, around ethical questions inherent in a legacy collection of human remains, and community engagement. So the Postmortem Project engaged museum visitors focus groups, which could also be virtual, so people could attend from wherever in the world they were, and surveys out on the streets of Philadelphia to really ask people who were either highly invested in the museum, those are the people on site, or people who had never heard of the museum, who might just be waiting for their bus at the Frankfurt Transit Center, what they are interested in and wanted to learn. We have an enormous collection of material related to the history of medicine. And so part of this community engagement project was, well, what interests you as a Philadelphian? What interests you as a museum visitor about the history of medicine, or the histories inherent in medicine that we could be telling? How can we enrich the visitor experience? And the community engagement aspect also dug into some of these specific questions that you yourself have raised about the conditions under which a specimen might have come to a museum, or the conditions, the living conditions of an individual whose bodily difference resulted in either their entire body or a portion of their body ending up here. The inward-facing part of the project was what's called an institutional genealogy, which dug into the history of the institution itself, the history of its collecting practices, really scouring through the many, many records that are attached to a collection that dates from the late 1840s, and getting a better understanding of the conditions under which this collection was assembled, where material came from, when the material came from, and really, for the first time, starting to reconcile archival records that are just in this building with themselves. Those two parts, the community engagement and the internal research, are starting now to come together and really shape the way in which our institution hopes to move forward. One of the very clear pieces of feedback that we started to see emerge very early in this community engagement process is that people wanted more. They wanted information, they wanted context, they wanted transparency, they wanted clarity from the museum. And as we thought about, well, how do we provide that? We started to turn to our internal research process. And this is when we became curious whether we could de-anonymize an anonymous medical specimen and give a fuller context beyond just the pathology that you're looking at.
Quick question. I'm not a scientist. What does I'll
back up. These are anonymous specimens. So, like, let's say your interesting eye condition, your physician takes a picture of it and publishes an article. Like, you are going to be anonymized in that article. So this is a tradition of anonymizing a patient when you're using their depiction or their biological material for teaching is a very long one. So when the material came into our collection, again, it came in with the name of the donor, the physician, but not the patient's name. So as we got this feedback about context, clarity, transparency, that is when we decided to see if we could push our research a little bit further and reaffiliate a specimen, an anonymous medical specimen, with a human identity or a human community. And that's
a hard work.
It's probably the most gratifying research I've ever done in my life. And we thought that we could probably get back to a community, an ethnic group, based on place where someone received treatment or the physician who treated them. But what we really wanted to test is, could we get back to a specific named identity? And what we discovered was that for many of the specimens that came from the bodies of Philadelphians that originated from the city of Philadelphia, we are able to do that. Not in every case, but if it has a Philly connection, we are often able to triangulate various archival sources to get back to a name. We've also become super users of Ancestry.com. I can take initials and like a date of death and often get to to a person's death certificate and their identity.
Why is that the most gratifying research for
Really?
you?
That doesn't sound gratifying to you.
I just want you to.
It's a detective story.
Yeah. I think, to me, well, first of all, we weren't sure if it could be done when we started. And so there's that little, adrenaline rush when you're like, oh, wow, this works. But what became really emotionally satisfying for me and my team was to restore a specimen back to a name, a story, a community. We de-anonymized a specimen earlier this year who lived in the same section of West Philadelphia as I lived in. The floor plan of his house, our houses were built in the same era. The floor plan of the house that he lived in is identical to the floor plan of the house that I live in now. We started to understand that there are connections to these past actors that we can be building on in this spirit of what people were asking us for, right? The greater context, the greater clarity, more transparency about the origins of the collection.
Even if you're just coming in because you want to see something kind of strange that you've never seen before, we want you to leave being like, oh, I really resonated in a very personal way with something that I saw here. And it made me feel something. I might not know what to do with that feeling, right? We think that that's a real portal to not just understanding and having a lot of respect for the people whose remains are on display in the museum, but that is a vehicle for fostering a greater and deeper empathy with the people that are around you today. That still, anatomical diversity does not just exist in the museum, it exists all around us. And so we want you to be able to walk around the city of Philadelphia and see the level of bodily diversity in the city of Philadelphia and have more compassion for that. So this might seem like an odd place to foster that type of compassion, but we really see that as fundamental, both to the respectful stewardship of the collection, but also to our responsibility to the public.
All right, let's keep talking about this after the break. September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. Kidney cancer is one of the most common types of childhood cancer. The Kidney Center Association is committed to creating awareness and raising funds for research to find a cure through Chalk Your Walk. Kids, artists, and anyone with a heart for kids can raise awareness for childhood kidney cancer by chalking up their pavement with messages of hope. Find out more at chalkyourwalk.org. Some of the people whose bodies are here at the museum that you've de-anonymized through the Postmortem Project had in their lifetimes participated in these dime shows. They were also called freak shows. People would pay a dime to see people with unusual physical traits. Tell me about Joseph Williams, the man whose mega colon is on display here.
I think we have kind of a reflex towards being like, oh my God, it's just so horrible that these guys had to show themselves in the dime show. What a story of exploitation. And labor historians and disability historians of spaces like the Dime Museum will often point to it's not really easy to delineate it between being exploitation or any this was a way for them to support their families. For instance, Joseph Williams, when he was pushed out of the larger labor market, it allowed him to live independently for longer. What we see, especially with Joseph Williams, nobody knew what was going on with him. He didn't know what the condition was that he had. It was a condition that caused a lot of suffering. Doctors could not really give him many answers, but we see consistently through his life that he was going to try and find answers. So he wasn't just this passive recipient of suffering and exploitation. We see him making really active choices, whether that's pursuing medical care or pursuing employment at the Dime Museum, that allowed him to live an independent life in the body that he had.
Joseph from Philadelphia or from the Philly region?
Yeah.
So when we began our research into him, we knew his initials and we knew his Dime Museum name. And we were able to use those two pieces of information to fairly quickly get to a full name and an identity. We know that he worked in foundries and oil refineries before he was sort of pushed out, again, as Sarah was saying, of the more formal labor market. He was working in Philadelphia. He was buried in Philadelphia. That cemetery is no longer there. We've been less successful in finding him in the census. If your listeners are from Philadelphia, you know that Williams is a very common surname in this region. But we haven't given up. But, when he died at age 29, his mother and his brother worked with the coroner to try to understand the condition that Williams had lived in. So, we know his family was local. They were here. They were involved in his life. They were invested in knowing what the condition he had lived with was.
And the dime shows were a form of entertainment in Philadelphia during what time?
This particular dime museum opened in 1882, is at 9th and Arch. This sort of institution, sometimes they're called museums, sometimes they're called theaters, but they're essentially putting on these shows that might range from people with extraordinary bodies to more traditional performers, like a singing group. There might also be trained animals. These could be very eclectic institutions. So Joseph Williams, the man with the megacolon, we know that, again, his mother and his brother were working closely with the coroner who conducted the autopsy on Joseph Williams. And we know that after the autopsy, his brother took custody of Williams' body for burial. And so that body would have looked very different after the removal of his colon. So again, we don't know what conversations were being had. We don't know what words were being used, but we do know that, sort of William's closest surrogates, his family members, were present and were there, and that they knew by taking custody of his body after the autopsy that his colon had been removed. So we can now share that information with our visitors and engage them in helping us think through, what does that say about the agreements that were being made in that moment? What types of choices were being made in that moment? Who was involved in making those choices? It was the people closest to Williams.
Is it then, are you going to give that specimen back to the community, or how does that work?
I would say I feel like that's a natural question for people to ask, because it's the one that people are sort of, I think, trained to think about, especially with something like, the repatriation of indigenous remains being something that's, not only ethically correct, but like legally mandated, right? So there's already sort of an existing framework for, if remains are identified, the next step is to return them. The sort of important distinction for us to draw is that repatriation in that context is a really specific process, and it is one that is between an institution and, in this case, a sovereign nation, right? So when a museum repatriates an ancestor to a tribe, it is to that tribe as a sovereign nation. So that same framework doesn't really clearly extend to something like, lineal descendants, right? Where if someone died in 1830, they have hundreds of lineal descendants today, right? So like even sort of determining what type of ownership framework would be is just very obviously, compared to something like the repatriation of ancestors, is already something that becomes very, very complicated. So instead, the way that we are thinking about it is that by gathering biographical information about specimens, it just opens up a multitude of different pathways for us to think about what justice would look like for that person, right? So that might involve, if we can't find a name, but we can locate someone to a religious community or, an ethnic community or a neighborhood, working with descendant communities or like active members of those communities to talk about like what is interpretation, like what would it look like to interpret this specimen in a way that like showcases their belonging, within that community. What did it mean to be a member of this neighborhood or a member of this community during this time period? And can we use this specimen as a vehicle for enriching our understanding of that experience? There are probably going to be cases where like identifying someone by name in like a label text, it doesn't necessarily add to the story, but it's more information that we can have, whether or not they were a public hospital patient versus, a very prominent Quaker that received care in their home. So we think of, the purpose of gathering a richer biographical profile, not as being towards the goal of like giving remains back, because again, the question of back to who is always very relevant. In many cases, like not only is that sort of one relevant question, but even the sort of like logistics of that, right? Like these are very like fragile specimens. They are specimens that are preserved in like deeply flammable and poisonous material. We're saying let's gather information, and by gathering information, we can be strategic and intentional about what next steps look like, in a more tailored way, rather than trying to make that decision sort of at a collections-based level.
Okay.
And one other thing just to sort of think about here is disease strikes the rich and it strikes the poor, right? So in our collection, which is a collection, again, of pathological material, there is a really wide range of sort of socioeconomic diversity in there. The man that I referenced earlier, who also lived in West Philadelphia, he was a white man. He did not have any lineal descendants. He moved here from New Jersey. He was a restaurant worker. So is his community West Philadelphia, where he died? Is his community New Jersey, where he lived before he moved across the river? Is his community people who worked in restaurants? There's a number of different ways to sort of think through what that looks like.
Another very kind of specific example of that, which resonates, I think, very strongly with the collection that you see when you're walking through the museum, is, the people, and I've referenced this already many times in the conversation, a lot of the people that oftentimes feel the most intense kind of personal stake in or like see themselves reflected and like feel community with the person behind the glass is often like a person that has a shared experience of disability, right? So if we think about the people that will stand at the teratology or like be at the teratology exhibit and feel a lot and feel a stake in the way that those some of those specimens are interpreted are people that are looking at fetuses with spina bifida and have an experience of spina bifida. There is not necessarily any genetic relationship between those two people, but they have the strongest stake in like narrating what that condition is and what it means and how it influences the way that people move through the world. In a medical collection, you often find the strongest affinity in like a non-biological connection, whether it's through, again, like religious community, whether it's through, someone's labor history, or whether it's through someone's experience of disability. And so by loosening up how we're thinking about descendant communities towards this idea of communities of care, it allows us to engage and really foreground the voices of people, living with, either disabilities or some type of, chronic condition or disease state, and involve them as like stakeholders in interpretation rather than just limiting it to the issue of like lineal descendants.
So what are the new policies? What can you do? What can't you do? Yeah, break that down for me.
What we wanted to do with these new policies was to really provide, again, clarity for our staff around how we're going to collect and steward human remains, and clarity for our visitors in decisions like taking images in the museum. I don't think, as long as I know, we have not permitted personal photography in the museum, but we wanted to, re-examine some of those policies, just make them clear, get them on our website, share them out so people understand the ways in which we're thinking about what is responsible and respectful stewardship.
Can you explain or tell me what are the policies for the staff?
It's like the technical policy that we follow as staff. So that policy defines what we consider to be a human remain. So we go all the way down to hair and teeth. It lays out that we will only accept future donations from either living donors or by bequest, but that we are prioritizing our stewardship of our current collection over acquisition.
And then any online digital collections, what are the guidelines?
To really foreground educational content, that material that goes online should have a defined educational purpose. It should have a learning objective. There should be a learning goal associated with it. That's moving forward. We are restoring Many of the videos that were on our YouTube channel, I think about 80% are going to go back up. But right now we're concentrating on making a better viewing experience for folks with those. So we're taking this moment to do some digital housekeeping to really think through what is the best viewing experience that we can provide for viewers to that channel. And in the process, we are retiring material that's just clearly out of date.
I want to talk about the future, and really specifically this story slam that's coming up on September 24th. Sarah, tell me about that.
We on August 20th held one of our final share out events for Postmortem, which really was sort of I call it the kind of deep nerd dive into the research. So you were there, you saw kind of a poster presentation about this research process. You heard from our collections research specialist. So we really wanted to land this grant project by really centering the human experience, right? Not just talking to you about this really interesting research project, but really looping back to some of the fundamental goals of the grant, which are to highlight these connections between our collection, our museum, and people from many different walks of life. So on September 24th, we're going to be working in partnership with the fantastic Philadelphia organization First Person Arts to put on a story slam where we'll have 6 people with really varied and interesting touch points to the collection, speaking from their perspective about what a collection like this means to them. We have people, for instance, that are doing really fascinating genealogical research, or people that are in legacy human remains research space, a participant in one of our youth programs, some people from the disability community, just sort of using this as an opportunity to bring 6 voices together in conversation with me as a representative of the museum to just think really broadly about the diversity of experiences that a place like this connects to, as a way to, again, really center and land this grant project back in the human experience of the general public.
Sarah, Erin, thank you so much for breaking this all down with me on CityCast Philly today.
Of course, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed our conversation with the Mütter Museum, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. And don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Philly neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.